Top scientists want you to know that temperatures in the United States are the warmest in 1,500 years. Temperatures have risen dramatically since 1980. These are the dire findings in a new climate change report drafted by scientists in 13 federal agencies. Scientists leaked this report because it contradicts Trump's backward stand on climate change. These experts are terrified that the report will be hijacked and the truth suppressed by the extremists in the Trump administration. Their fears are well-founded. This landmark report awaits final approval by Trump. That's if he can stop tweeting. The report warns that it is, quote, extremely likely that more than half of the global mean temperature increase since 1951 can be linked to human influence. The fear is Trump will say something like, all the experts thought it was extremely unlikely Hillary Clinton was going to beat me. They were wrong. What do the experts know? That's a very good fear for them to have, given what Trump has said and the way he behaves. The report also finds with, quote, very high confidence that the number and intensity of colder nights has decreased while the occurrence and severity of warm days has escalated since the 1960s. Since Trump and many Republicans are at war with science, they will distort the term very high confidence to mean scientists are uncertain, when in fact there is virtual unanimity among scientists who aren't employed by the Koch brothers. Trump has already embarrassed the United States and put the world at risk by withdrawing from the Paris Accords. I guess Trump is making America great again by joining Syria and Nicaragua as the world's only countries to reject the historic climate deal. Many leading Republicans remain in denial, despite last year being one of the hottest on record since 1880. This makes 2016 the third year in a row to set a new record for global average surface temperatures. Yes, we should all be terrified. The report warns it is very likely that the accelerated rate of Arctic warming will have a significant consequence for the United States due to accelerating land and sea ice melting that is driving changes in the ocean, including sea level rise, threatening our coastal communities. Climate change deniers say that fixing the problem will be expensive, to which I reply, not nearly as expensive as the cost of New York City, Miami, and the world's largest naval base at Norfolk, Virginia, going underwater. The report also cautions that if we don't mobilize to reverse climate change, it could lead to longer heat waves, more intense rainstorms, and quicker destruction of coral reefs. As if on cue, Europeans are enduring a brutal heat wave they've dubbed Lucifer. Temperatures have also reached as high as 104 degrees in usually cold Seattle and 107 degrees in Portland, Oregon. Is this the way we really want to live, assuming we'll continue living at all? A terrifying New York Times op-ed by science writer Peter Brannon compared the consequences of what we are now doing to the Earth to the end of the Permian period 250 million years ago. Elevated levels of carbon dioxide in the air also marked this period. The result was the loss of 90% of sea life and 75% of life on land. The end of the Permian period was known as the Great Dying. It took 10 million years for the planet to recover. Climate change prophet Al Gore's new movie is finally out, an inconvenient sequel, Truth to Power. I suggest everyone see it to fully grasp the enormity of the climate change crisis that confronts us. When the history books are written, President Trump may be remembered as divisive, crazy, lying, corrupt, treasonous, a buffoon, but those failures might pale in comparison to Trump's legacy as the man who arrogantly and stupidly ignored the dire warnings of scientists worldwide and put the Earth on a path to irreversible ruin. We have to act to ensure this new climate report is signed off on. Go to my website, WayneBesenShow.com. That's WayneBesenShow.com. Click the tab, Take Action. Find your member of Congress and urge them to support the release of the federal climate change report. If we act together, maybe, just maybe, we can stop this madness and mayhem being perpetrated by Donald Trump. Coming up next, while racial segregation has declined, it has been replaced with economic segregation in our major cities. I discuss this disturbing phenomenon with Richard Kahlenberg of the Century Foundation right after this short break. To me, The Wayne Besen Show is much more than a program. It is a quest to bring top-notch progressive programming online so we can level the playing field and take back our country from the brink of madness. Support progressive media. Support The Wayne Besen Show. please consider offering your generous financial support for my show. Join Besen's bandwagon today for only $10 a month or $120 a year. If you're able to give more, please consider doing so. The greater our resources, the more we can fight back and lay the groundwork for a progressive nation. Be a hero. I can only continue producing my show with your help. Richard Kahlenberg, fellow at the Century Foundation and the author of All Together Now, Creating Middle-Class Schools Through Public School Choice. He's also the author of a new report, An Economic Fair Housing Act. Welcome to the show.
Oh, well, thanks so much for having me.
In your recent New York Times op-ed, you mentioned that about 100 years ago, there was a racial zoning law in Louisville, Kentucky that was overturned. Talk about the importance of this case.
Yeah, this is the Buchanan case, Buchanan versus Worley, back in 1917, and it was a big advance for racial equity and human freedom because it struck down a Louisville ordinance in which the local officials had a law which said if you were African American or any other minority group, you could not purchase a home in a majority white neighborhood. It was racial zoning that is really part of a larger history in this country where we've socially engineered racial and economic segregation. But in that decision, back in 1917, the Supreme Court said this violates the 14th Amendment. We can't stand for those types of policies.
And in fact, in my city, Chicago, there is still a lot of evidence of this. I mean, highways, for example, built to separate different neighborhoods, and some African Americans could not, until the 70s, really move to different neighborhoods without facing violence. So this is really something that is going on for quite some time in this country.
Yes, no, it's embedded for many years, embedded in our laws. There were racial covenants which said that if you bought a house, you had to agree not to resell it to an African American, and there was redlining where the federal government, in providing mortgage insurance for individuals to allow more people to buy homes, they would not invest in majority black neighborhoods. And there was one case that was particularly egregious, where the federal government refused to invest in a white neighborhood, a new white development, until the developer agreed to build a wall between the white neighborhood and the adjoining black neighborhood to make sure that they remained segregated. A physical wall had to be built before the federal government would provide funding for the new development. So it's a really shameful history we have in this country.
And of course, there was efforts, as you mentioned, the Supreme Court Buchanan versus Worley to deal with this. But then people got creative and they started zoning based upon economic restrictions. Tell us more about economic zoning, where it came from, and what it meant for this country.
Right. Well, economic zoning is pervasive. It occurs in neighborhoods throughout this country. Basically, local zoning laws will say not only can you not build, a cement factory, understandable, in a residential neighborhood, but also they're going to dictate the terms of how big the houses are, how big the lot sizes are, restricting apartment buildings or townhouses. They have to be standalone single-family homes. This is a degree of government interference in the marketplace which really drives up the price of housing and economically segregates us. And as you're suggesting, there's been a racial motive throughout much of this economic zoning as well. After the Buchanan decision came down, a lot of jurisdictions said, okay, we can't zone by race, but if we put up these impediments, say you can't build an apartment building anywhere in this community, then we'll essentially keep out African Americans and low-income people of all races.
Our guest is Richard Kahlenberg, fellow at the Century Foundation and the author of All Together Now, Creating Middle-Class Schools Through Public School Choice. And he has a new report called An Economic Fair Housing Act. The Supreme Court dealt with this question in 1926 on economic zoning, and they actually said this was constitutional, and they called some apartment complexes parasites. What was the effect of this ruling?
Well, it allowed economic zoning, sometimes called exclusionary zoning, to multiply throughout the country. We didn't used to have all these complex sets of zoning laws. There was much more freedom in development, but over time, we saw communities after community put up these walls, these barriers to low-income people, and in some upper middle-class communities, it's even middle-class people who are excluded because of these zoning laws that were partly racist in origin, but today have proliferated and driven up economic segregation. The good news over since the enactment of the 1968 Fair Housing Act is there's been a slow decline in racial segregation, but we're seeing an explosion in economic segregation in large measure because of these government zoning laws.
And you point out in the New York Times that Robert Putnam, a political scientist at Harvard, referred to this as a, quote, kind of incipient class apartheid. What has the impact of this phenomenon been on American life? Well,
where you live has an enormous impact on your life chances. The neighborhood you can live in determines whether there are going to be jobs nearby, whether you have access to transportation, good health care, and probably most importantly, whether your kids will have access to good schools. So we know that low-income students who have the chance to go to middle-class schools perform much better than low-income students who are segregated into economically, high poverty schools where all the classmates are poor as well, and so we're really frustrating the American dream when we allow for government zoning laws to further segregate us by economic status.
What's interesting is, you look at the last election, Donald Trump reached out to the white working class. That's considered his base. But this policy of economic segregation, originally intended to hurt minorities, is also harming a lot of that white base. As you point out in the New York Times, there has been a 145% increase among non-Hispanic whites living in high-poverty neighborhoods. What is the effect on those who have gone down the ladder of prosperity and suddenly find themselves on the wrong side of the tracks?
Well, that's right. This economic zoning hurts poor whites, working-class whites, along with working-class African Americans and Latinos. The best-selling book by J.D. Vance, Hillbilly Elegy, talks about the ways in which low-income whites are increasingly cut off from others in their communities. They have fewer role models to look to because they're economically segregated, and so this is something that's affecting people of all different races in a very negative fashion.
And on a slightly different note, but it ties in, you have the Mayor de Blasio of New York City wanting the wealthiest to pay or at least subsidize subway and bus fares for those on the lower end of the economic ladder, because New York City, just as San Francisco and Boston and Washington, Seattle, a lot of these places, housing is unaffordable, and the economic segregation in terms of housing is rather extreme today.
Yeah, it's increasing dramatically, and when people can't afford to live near their jobs, it has real consequences for their daily lives. So, a single mother who's struggling to raise her kids and earn a decent wage has to take 2 buses to get to work, And then when the buses aren't working quite right one day, she misses the exchange. She gets to work late. She's fired. The economic segregation hurts people in their daily lives constantly, and it's really the shame of all this is that it doesn't have to be that way. We, in part, economic segregation is the result of economic inequality in the larger society. But then on top of that, we have these government rules that are making things worse that we have control over, and that's what's so discouraging.
And I'm sure this wasn't the intent when these were put in place, but today the environmental report was leaked from the scientific agencies and discussed man-made climate change. These policies in terms of housing lessen density and make people travel far further in their cars. It makes it less conducive to mass transit. So this surely has had an indirect effect on the climate change issue as well, and pollution in our cities.
Absolutely. I mean, urban-suburban sprawl is the enemy of the environment. When people have to drive longer distances, they pollute the environment more. Smart growth would call for greater density. And so what I'm hoping is that there will be kind of an interesting alliance between environmentalists, civil rights activists, affordable housing advocates on the left, and some interesting, strange bedfellows on the right who would support efforts to reduce economic zoning. So you have, developers have an interest in more density because they can make more money when they build more units. So they're a natural ally in this. And the other unusual group in this potential coalition are the libertarians, who, just based on principle, are opposed to overregulation by the government. So I'm hoping that in this kind of populist moment that we live in, we can redirect away from the negative, racially tinged populism of Donald Trump to something much more progressive, where we can start tearing down these walls that are keeping us apart.
In theory, I like the idea. My concern, though, when you talk about bringing in libertarians and those on the right, is they seem to abandon those positions when it's convenient. I'll give you a couple of examples. Conservatives abandoned the states' rights position when it came to marriage equality. They wanted a federal amendment to ban same-sex marriage. And we see it possibly again today with the states' rights worshipping Attorney General Jeff Sessions is now threatening to go after states that have legalized or decriminalized cannabis. So do you think their anti-government regulation fervor might be offset by some of the advantages they are getting, such as higher property values, and some of them, of course, aren't displeased with racial segregation either?
Right. No, I take your point. I would distinguish between conservatives generally and then, this group of libertarians who are, against government regulation, whether it's, on abortion or in the economy. And there have been enough libertarians who've written on this issue of exclusionary zoning and economic zoning to suggest to me that there's a group of principled libertarians who would be allies. I'm not by any means suggesting that the conservatives on the whole would support efforts to promote economic and racial integration. There hasn't been evidence of that for quite some time. So I take that point.
Our guest, Richard Kahlenberg, fellow at the Century Foundation, and we're talking about economic inequality in terms of housing. And you discussed an updated Fair Housing Act that addresses such economic segregation. How would that work to address these concerns?
Yeah, so the 1968 Fair Housing Act, enacted almost a half century ago, made it illegal to discriminate based on race and national origin, religion, a couple of other categories. But it said nothing about economic status. And so today, half century later, when we see rising economic segregation, I think it's time for us to take on the government policies that are excluding people based on income. And so I think we need to start with progressive states. Washington's kind of a mess right now, Washington, D.C. But in progressive states where people realize that housing is unaffordable, that segregation is bad for our society, there should be state-level efforts to enact legislation that would prohibit localities from excluding people based on income. And that could take a couple of different forms. One would be an outright prohibition on these exclusionary zoning laws. Another could be a provision which would withhold some funding, some state funding for localities that are trying to exclude people based on income. And there are variations to this, but that's the basic idea.
Yeah, I see this as a corollary to a fight that's going on with school funding in Illinois. You have some school districts where it's $20,000 or more per student, others where it's about $5,000, and they're trying to equalize the funding. But those in districts that are getting more funding, which would mirror some of these neighborhoods we're talking about that are on the high end of economic segregation, are saying, you know what, I don't care if somebody else's kid is only getting $5,000 for the school year in their district. We like it the way it is, and we like these advantages. And so there's some pushback there. What kind of pushback would you expect to lawmakers trying to push for an updated Fair Housing Act that addresses economic segregation? How fierce would it be?
Oh, I think there'll be intense resistance. The people who set up the rules as they are benefiting greatly from the status quo. So if you live in an exclusive neighborhood where you have to have quarter-acre lot and either no apartment buildings or townhouses nearby, the government regulations are artificially and unfairly inflating your housing value, and so they're gonna fight this with everything they can. My one piece of hope is that there have been instances where the majority of Americans who are not benefiting from those extreme exclusionary zoning policies made sure to come out and vote and push for more inclusion. I'm thinking, for example, in a vote in Massachusetts where they were trying to overturn an anti-snob zoning program, and so this was a law which said if there are fewer than 10% of people in your community who have are modest income, then you have to open up your community, and wealthy people hated that. They tried to get the law overturned, and they lost in a voter referendum with 59% saying let's keep that more inclusive style. So there's some reason for hope that a populist coalition, cross-racial coalition, could come together to support inclusion.
So it's possible that we could see more referendums and have a direct vote on this, and that's actually a way to get this done. So this could duplicate itself. Are there a lot of groups dedicated to this? Is this something that's on their agenda, or are you bringing new ideas out there that need people to organize around them?
Well, this is a modification of an old idea. So, the Fair Housing Act, which was passed a generation ago, has broad support among civil rights groups and affordable housing advocates and the society in general. People think it's wrong to discriminate based on race. It happens. Believe me, it happens frequently. But people are ashamed. A landlord who's accused of racial discrimination or convicted of racial discrimination is ashamed for doing so. There's a stigma to that. Unfortunately, right now, there isn't the same stigma to excluding people based on income. And so I think, this is a modification of an existing idea that we really want to try to change the culture and get people to see that it's wrong to put up barriers that keep low income and working class families from enjoying the benefits in our society.
Richard Kahlenberg, fellow at the Century Foundation and the author of All Together Now, Creating Middle-Class Schools Through Public School Choice, and the author of a new report, An Economic Fair Housing Act. Thank you so much for appearing on the Wayne Besen Show. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's wonderful to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Now let's dive into the swamp with the Daily News Roundup. The Washington Post reports on a chilling new survey from Qualtrics Online that reports nearly half of Republicans believe Trump won the popular vote and would support postponing the 2020 election. 47% of Republicans say Trump got the most votes in 2016, when in reality Hillary Clinton received nearly 3 million more votes. 68% of Republicans falsely believe that millions of illegal immigrants voted, and 73% said voter fraud happens very often, even though it's virtually non-existent. Here comes the scary part. 52% of Republicans say that they would support postponing the 2020 election, and 56% of Republicans would go along with this if both Trump and Congress called for a postponement. Hello fascism, hello dictatorship. Who says it couldn't happen here? The FBI is closing in on Donald Trump. They raided the house of former campaign chairman Paul Manafort, executing a search warrant with probable cause. This is bad news for Trump because Manafort, faced with possible prison time, was privy to Trump's inner circle and a prime candidate to flip and rat out the president. Special counsel Robert Mueller also asked the White House for documents relating to National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. North Korea has threatened to attack Guam following President Trump's wild, off-the-cuff remark that the United States is prepared to unleash fire and fury like the world has never seen. The world is now having a debate I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. Who's a bigger crackpot and threat to the world, Kim Jong-un or the President of the United States? The U.S. has 6,800 nuclear warheads, and during the campaign it was reported that Trump asked a foreign policy expert 3 times that since we have nuclear weapons, why can't we use them? This is even more disconcerting now that special counsel Robert Mueller is closing in on Trump. Might a war, even a nuclear war, be used as a diversionary tactic? Again, I never thought I'd say that before, but with this president, you never know. On the topic of war, we have to ask ourselves if we might actually lose. Sure, we have the most powerful military in the world. Yes, we spend more than the next 8 nations combined on our military. But how much is that going to matter with Donald Trump as commander-in-chief? It's like letting my dog Doinkers drive a Ferrari. It's probably not going to end well. To quote fired communications director Anthony Scaramucci, a fish rots from the head down. And does anyone doubt we have a mullet sitting in the Oval Office? Some people comfort themselves by saying once war starts, a president has little control over tactics. Don't be naive and don't bet on it. Trump has already said he knows more than the generals. When asked whom he consults with on foreign affairs and military matters, Trump said during the campaign, "I'm speaking with myself, number one, because I have a very good brain." The writing is on the wall. You are likely going to have military orders given by tweet. He will unwittingly give away classified military positions to the enemy, and Trump will interfere with military operations like we've never seen before. And I can't see that ending well for us. Moving along, President Trump attacked Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell today after McConnell told a crowd that the president didn't understand the pace of Washington, which led to excessive expectations. Trump tweeted in response, after 7 years hearing repeal and replace, "Why not done?" Well, as they say, a broken clock is right twice a day, and I have to side with Trump on this one. McConnell was so busy trying to undermine Obama, he never came up with his own health care plan. Instead, he slapped together a useless pile of trash that the Senate rejected that would have left 20 to 30 million Americans without health insurance. Instead of health care, it's more like health kill. This health kill debacle proves the Republican Party is nothing more than an attack machine that can block legislation but can't build America. It can obstruct, but it cannot construct our nation's crumbling infrastructure. USA Today reports Americans are saving less while their bills keep getting larger. We'll discuss more about the declining middle class tomorrow. Finally, 5 transgender organizations are suing over Trump's transgender tweet banning them from military service. Right now, you have transgender special forces putting their lives on the line, while a president who dodged the draft with alleged bone spurs has threatened their careers. To quote a presidential tweet, sad. This is the Wayne Besen Show. Visit my website at WayneBesenShow.com. Become a member today by hopping on Besen's bandwagon. For just $10 a month, you can support this show and independent progressive media. Again, WayneBesenShow.com. If you enjoy the show, please support it. See you tomorrow. Have a great day.